Throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s, after the devastating Korean War, North Korea had a moderate spending in its military expenses. During the same era, North Korea continued to assert its independence, a much-needed effort after the country had vastly depended on China and the Soviet Union during the war. In 1956, during a meeting of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea, Kim Il-sung was able to defeat and start the purge of the most closely pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions within the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. With Kim Il-sung reasserting his control of North Korea, one may find the origin of the Kim Dynasty's control over the country at this moment. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm Stan and I heard you missed me. Well, the reason I haven't been around so much is because our YouTube team is expanding and there are other people that can cover my duties here while I go do other team managing stuff. We are still looking for more people to join our YouTube team, so if you're into video editing or audio editing, please give us a message. We even pay a little, but yeah, it's not much. In other news, we've also just released the 5th issue of the Tank Encyclopedia magazine, which you can find on PayHip. If you buy it, you can read about the Lancia 1ZM armored car, about the Vickers Mark 7, the Semovente da 4732, and even the Guarani, the new Brazilian armored personnel carrier. And all of this for only $5, so it's really a steal. Go check it out, link in the description. Now let's get back to North Korea. Throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s, after the devastating Korean War, North Korea had a moderate spending in its military expenses. During the same era, North Korea continued to assert its independence, a much-needed effort after the country had vastly depended on China and the Soviet Union during the war. In 1956, during a meeting of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea, Kim Il-sung was able to defeat and start the purge of the most closely pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions within the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. With Kim Il-sung reasserting his control of North Korea, one may find the origin of the Kim Dynasty's control over the country at this moment. The very large-scale destruction caused by the Korean War required considerable resources to attempt to repair and compensate for. The military was fairly well equipped but remained at a fairly moderate size. By the end of the 1950s, only 350,000 servicemen made up the KPA, the North Korean Army, making them quite numerically outnumbered by the 650,000 strong ROKA, the Army of South Korea. In terms of armor, while North Korea had received small quantities of T-54-2s and T-54-3s in the 1950s, the bulk of its forces still operated the T-34-85, of which there were about 1,000. Like all nations in the 1960s, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea also had an economic boom which was particularly felt in the industry. It went from assembling Soviet-made vehicles to producing the first licensed copies of PT-76Bs in 1967 and T-55 in 1968. The city where the industry developed was Kusong, north of Pyongyang, where a large part of the military industry of the DPRK is concentrated, with launching sites for intercontinental missiles, uranium mines, and the Kusong Machinery Factory, a significant military facility where most heavy tracked vehicles of the Korean People's Army are manufactured. The driving factor behind the metamorphosis of the KPA from an army of moderate size to the oversized behemoth it is now was the growth of the Chuche ideology in the 1960s. Developed by Kim Il-sung, this branch of Marxism-Leninism focused on North Korea's need for independence from the Soviet Union and China at a time when both were fairly hostile to each other. With North Korea not fully aligned with any of the two, they would not sell their most advanced technology to the Korean state. As a result, the need for North Korea to be able to produce its own armored vehicles, as well as massively expand its military to be able to defend itself or even attack South Korea on its own, was now apparent. On the armor side, this translated into North Korea starting to acquire large quantities of armored vehicles from both China and the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, and particularly 1970s. Though this may seem paradoxical, seeing as North Korea wanted to assert its independence, some of those armament deals include a large involvement of North Korea's military industry, a crucial step in developing this domain which would be crucial to assert the DPRK's military independence. From China, North Korea received a number of Type 62 and Type 63 light tanks and larger quantities of Type 59s, likely over 1,000. These deliveries would continue for a while, longer than those from the Soviet Union. Though North Korea would negotiate with both countries after the Sino-Soviet split, it appears to have remained generally closer to China. China also delivered a quantity of YW531A or Type 63A armored personnel carriers in 1967. From the Soviet Union, North Korea took massive orders of a variety of armored vehicles. Many of those orders did include some form of assembly or production in North Korea, helping set up production facilities. It appears around 2,000 T-54s and T-55s were assembled by the DPRK between the late 60s and the mid-70s. These vehicles already incorporated some minor modifications, like replacing the Soviet 12.7mm machine guns with the heavier 14.5mm KPV. A likely far lower but still unknown number of PT-76s was also assembled in North Korea during the same period, with the first leaving their factory in 1967. Now, it isn't exactly known how much of the components were made in North Korea. In any case, two major results came out of these North Korean production runs. North Korea now had the facilities able to produce armored vehicles, as well as a very large stock of Soviet and Chinese MBTs, which massively enlarged the KPA's armored force, dwarfing South Korea's at this point. This large mass of T-54, T-55 and Type 59s are still in service to this day, though often overlooked due to the presence of much more modern and peculiar indigenous vehicles in North Korea's army. The DPRK took a big step forward in 1976, when it joined the Non-Aligned Movement, a group of nations that were not aligned with either of the two blocs of the Cold War, the Communists or NATO. With the Sino-Soviet split, joining the NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement, was a move out of the dependence on the two superpowers, but also proof of not taking any sides. With help from China appearing less and less likely in a new Korean war, North Korea also started to pursue infiltration policies, digging tunnels and infiltrating commandos by submarine into South Korea. This massively enlarged KPA was now a decisively offensive army that, at the time, had a large numbers advantage over the South. While not particularly being at a technological disadvantage, the South Koreans had no vehicles more advanced than M48 patterns and still used a large number of inferior M47s, M4 Shermans or M24 Chaffees. To further reinforce this now very large KPA tank force, as well as ensure the independence of its armored vehicles procurement, North Korea started to produce their own armored vehicles. The first of those is arguably the 323 Armored Personnel Carrier, often known as the VTT-323 in the West. Based on the Chinese Type 63, it features an additional road wheel and a rear-mounted turret featuring a fairly respectable armament of two 14.5mm KPV machine guns. The lengthening of its hull apparently allows it to maintain the 10 passengers capacity of the Type 63. The vehicle began production at the Sinong plant in 1973. At the time, it was actually a fairly potent APC. In comparison to American and South Korean M113s, the 323 offered vastly superior firepower with two turret-mounted 14.5mm machine guns in comparison to a single 12.7mm machine gun on a pintle mount. Amphibious capabilities were also superior, with about 10 km/h speed in water compared to the M113's 6. And although the M113 could carry an additional passenger, it was much less capable of supporting its dismounts in combat. This 323 armored personnel carrier would prove a mainstay of North Korea's mechanized troops, becoming the standard North Korean APC and seeing its hull used for a large number of roles. It also provided the basis for command variants, rocket launching vehicles, anti-tank vehicles, and anti-ship missile carriers. An amphibious tank was even designed using the chassis of the 323, the M1981 Chinook. Another phenomenon that started in the 1970s was North Korea designing self-propelled artillery pieces that combined a number of chassis, such as the Soviet ATS-59 tractors, 323s, and even Type 59s, to produce a variety of artillery pieces, such as the Tokchons, ATS-59 based vehicles mounting a plethora of guns, typically from 122 to 152mm in caliber, and the very peculiar Koksan, based on the Type 59 in mounting a very long-range indigenous 170mm artillery piece, one of the longest-range self-propelled artillery pieces of the era. The quantity of vehicles produced is hard to estimate, but exercises have shown wide numbers of Koksans and particularly Tokchons. It is likely that at least several hundreds were built. Another massive development initiated in the 1970s was the birth of the Chonma-ho. This was a North Korean version of the Soviet Union's T-62 main battle tank. Although it is often theorized that North Korea received a large quantity of T-62s from the Soviet Union, this is by no means confirmed and appears unlikely. Instead, the Soviet Union perhaps may have directly delivered machinery to set up a T-62 production line in North Korea, or just passed on the plans. In any case, production of the Chonma began in 1978. The tank actually combined the turret of the T-62 model 1972 and the hull of the T-62 model 1962. This turret was modified to mount a 14.5mm machine gun as well as handrails that could fit 14.5mm ammunition spares. The vehicle is often said to have had lightened armor, but there is no definitive proof of this. While the T-62 may not seem like the most modern tank by 1978, it was a considerable step above the best tanks of the South Korean army, which were the M48A3 and M48A5. Only in 1988 would a tank surpassing the Chonma enter service in the South Korean army, though this vehicle, the K-1, would outclass the North Korean vehicle very significantly. These first North Korean armored vehicles were all quite close to the original Chinese or Soviet designs. Though the North Koreans modified them, they were still far from creating entirely new armored vehicles on their own. They would come closer as they started designing more advanced AFVs in the 90s. The 1980s and early 1990s were marked by North Korea's military industry beginning production of a large variety of new armored vehicles to fulfill a large variety of roles. Those vehicles increasingly differed from Soviet and Chinese models. Some examples include the M1989, a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun developed in the 1980s, which, while based on the Shilka, had a dual 30mm armament based on Soviet CIWIS. In 1989, a newer, more advanced version of the Koksan was also observed by external viewers. By 1992, new self-propelled artillery pieces were first observed by an international audience, mounting a 122mm, 130 or 152mm gun in a fully rotatable turret. These were designated the M1991 and M1992. Other vehicles observed around this era included 323 based mortar carriers that had their armament in a fully rotatable turret, likely inspired by the 2S Nona, and a reconnaissance armored car / light armored personnel carrier designated as the M1992. In the 1980s, the Chonma series started to undergo a series of upgrades. In the West, the Chonma series is often divided into the Chonma 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but this is an oversimplified system of classification, with much more variants of the Chonma existing. In the 1980s, Chonmas received laser rangefinders, the first being spotted in a 1985 parade. North Korea also seemingly managed to acquire a single T-72 during the 1980s. This was an Ural which had likely been captured from Iraq by Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, and then acquired by North Korea. This vehicle would be heavily studied in order to use some of its technologies in North Korea's own main battle tanks. In 1992, a new version of the Chonma was first observed by international viewers, this time featuring some major modifications. The vehicle had a much more angular welded turret. It featured smoke launchers and explosive reactive armor. It was designated M1992 by the United States Department of Defense. A very similar vehicle with only slight modifications in smoke launchers and ERA is designated as the Chonma 92 by North Korean sources. Those newer models of the Chonma mark some considerable advancements in North Korean tank development, bringing some major improvements to the original Chonma T-62. Although the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, often referred to as the Hermit Kingdom, was and still is a country isolated from the rest of the world, it also extensively trades with foreign countries, with the Eastern Bloc back in the day, and still a large number of customers now. In many of the conflicts fought in recent decades, Korea has provided armaments, funding, or observers to some nations, often transgressing embargoes and ignoring the calls of the international community. Most notably, the DPRK trained insurgents during the Rhodesian Bush War, and provided significant material support to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. In the following decades, the DPRK has continued to sell weaponry to Iran, which then distributes it in the Middle East, notably to Hamas. Many other countries have bought weapons from North Korea though. The DPRK has provided military equipment or supported dozens of other wars and insurgencies, such as the Vietnam War, the Congo Civil War, the Angolan War, the Ugandan Bush War, the Sri Lankan Civil War and coup, and most recently, the Yemeni Civil War. And that's it for this video and this series on North Korea's Cold War history. We'll tackle the modern history a bit later. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe. You can find more information related to North Korea's development of armored fighting vehicles through the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want us to continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, stand out, keep us in your sights.